Hi, I'm Patrick. Today I'm going over couples who were chasing the perfect engagement photo, not knowing that the camera would be the last thing to see them alive. From a couple who ignored a train horn on a railroad bridge to a pair who recreated the Titanic pose on a budget boat, which ended in brutal ways I wasn't ready for. It was the 19th of August 2018, and the late afternoon sun baked a wide-open hayfield on the outskirts of a small ranching town in central Texas, where the grass had gone from gold to pale gray after 6 straight weeks without rain and burn ban notices had gone up along roads throughout the county. Kessler Bonham was 26 years old and worked as a welder at a steel fabrication shop about 30 minutes outside San Antonio. Tierney Wicks was 25 and worked as a dental hygienist at a family practice. They had been together for like 3 years and got engaged that spring. Friends later said Tierney had a Pinterest board with over 200 saved engagement photo ideas, and the colored smoke bomb shot was pinned right at the very top. She had been talking about that specific photo for months. Kessler had ordered a 6-pack of colored smoke canisters off the internet, specifically for the shoot. 2 pink, 2 blue, 2 purple. When they arrived at the field, the photographer had done smoke canister shoots before, and honestly didn't raise any concerns about the conditions. I think about that answer a lot because she was right. Dozens of couples have done that exact photo and nothing happened, and there is genuinely no way to explain why this time was different without just saying sometimes the odds catch up. The photographer picked a spot about 100 feet into the field where the grass was tallest and the light was best. Tierney wanted the golden hour framing she had saved screenshots of, like that specific look from Instagram. Kessler held a pink canister in one hand and a blue one in the other. Tierney held the remaining 2. The photographer backed up about 30 feet to get the wide shot. They ignited the canisters. The smoke looked exactly like the photos, thick-colored plumes drifting sideways in the light breeze. The photographer got several frames in the first 15 seconds. Then, a spark from one of the canisters landed in the dry grass near Kessler's feet. It caught almost instantly. The flame was small at first, maybe the size of a dinner plate, but the grass was just so dry, it spread outward in every direction within seconds. The photographer later said by the time she realized what was happening, the fire had already moved past her toward the road and she ran for the gravel shoulder. Kessler and Tierney were deeper in the field. They dropped the canisters and started running, but a gusting crosswind pushed the fire through the dry grass in long fingers that cut across multiple escape routes faster than any of them expected. Kessler cut to the left toward a dirt access track at the edge of the field and made it out of the grass. Tierney ran straight back the way they had come in, but the smoke cut off her visibility, and the fire had already cut across her path back toward the road. Investigators later believed she became disoriented in the heavy smoke after the fire crossed her escape route. A passing driver called 911 after seeing smoke from the road. The first volunteer fire unit arrived within about 10 minutes, with additional brush trucks shortly after. The field was pretty much entirely burned by then. Kessler was found at the edge of the dirt track with severe burns. He was airlifted to a regional burn center. Tierney was found well away from where they had been standing, in the burned section of the field. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A forensic examination determined the cause of death to be thermal injuries complicated by smoke inhalation. Kessler died at the burn center 2 days later from complications related to his injuries. Investigators confirmed a county burn ban had basically been in effect the entire time. The photographer's memory card was entered into evidence, and the final images showed the smoke plumes with the first flame visible at grass level in the bottom corner of the frame. This next one is probably the most preventable story in this entire video, and I think that's what makes it so hard to sit with, because the photographer was right there on safe ground the whole time, and all they had to do was stay next to her. It was the 14th of January, 2017. And a light snow had been falling since early morning across a lake in northern Minnesota, where the shoreline was rimmed with white ice that thinned toward the center due to recent temperature swings that had weakened sections away from shore. And a photographer in a heavy coat stood at the water's edge, adjusting her tripod, while 2 figures walked out onto the frozen surface. Andre Halverson was 33 years old and managed a cross-country ski rental shop in a small resort town. Linnea Nyquist was 31. And worked as a veterinary tech at an animal hospital about 20 minutes from their apartment. They had been together since college and got engaged over the holidays. Friends later said Andre had basically grown up skating on ponds in rural Minnesota and had this thing where he would stomp on the ice at the edge before walking out, like that was his safety check. Just a couple hard stomps with his boot, and if it held, he figured they were good. He did that at the shoreline that morning, stomped a few times, told Linnea it felt solid, and they just walked out. The thing about that stomp test is, it only tells you about the ice right where you're standing. And I think on some level he probably knew that, but he'd done it his whole life and nothing bad ever happened, so why would this time be any different? Their photographer later said she told them she wasn't comfortable going out on the ice and would shoot from shore with a long lens. Endra basically said that was fine. They would walk out about 80 feet to where the snow was clean and untouched for the backdrop. Linnea was wearing this long white coat she had picked out specifically for the photos. They reached roughly 80 feet from shore. The photographer had them face each other holding hands. She got a few frames. Then the ice cracked. Not at the edges where Andra had tested it, but beneath them, where the water was deeper and the ice was thinner. The break was sudden. One moment they were standing and the next the surface just collapsed and both of them plunged into the water. They managed to keep their upper bodies above the surface at first, but the shock was immediate. Both gasped and Linnea screamed. Andre tried to pull himself up onto the edge of the ice, but it kept breaking under his weight. Every piece he grabbed cracked and came off in his hands. The ice around the hole was basically too thin to hold him. Linnea was struggling beside him. The white coat she had worn for the photos was soaking up water and getting heavier by the second, pulling her shoulders down. The photographer screamed and called 911 from the shore. She could see them clearly from where she was standing, but there was nothing solid between her and them. No branch, no rope, nothing to reach across. The photographer stood right there at the edge and said, "No, I'm staying here," and they walked out anyway. And honestly, she had to watch the whole thing from the exact spot where she tried to stop them, and I keep wondering how she carries that. After several minutes, their movements became weaker and more disorganized. The cold quickly robbed them of coordination and strength. Their grip on the ice edges weakened as the cold just shut their hands down. Eventually, neither could keep themselves above the surface. Fire rescue arrived within about 20 minutes with cold water rescue equipment. Both were submerged by the time rescuers reached them. Resuscitation was attempted on shore, then both were transported to a regional hospital where they were pronounced dead. A forensic examination determined the cause of death for both to be drowning following cold water immersion. Water temperature was measured at like 34 degrees. Ice thickness at the breakpoint was only about 2 inches, compared to over 6 inches at the shoreline where Andre had done his stomp test. The photographer's images from that morning were reviewed during the investigation. Alright, so this next one is the one that frustrated me the most during research because the building they walked into had literally been condemned for years, and you could see it just by looking at it. It was the 6th of October 2019, and late afternoon light filtered through broken windows on the second floor of a former psychiatric hospital complex in a wooded area of upstate New York, where paint peeled from the walls in long curling strips and fallen ceiling tiles covered the floor in a layer of dust and debris. Phelan Driscoll was 28 years old and worked as an IT support tech at a company in Albany. Marisol Fuentes was 27 and worked as a hairstylist who did wedding parties at a salon near their apartment. They had gotten engaged that summer, and the photo shoot was kinda Marisol's project from the start. Her social media showed months of engagement planning content, and she had multiple posts about wanting a shoot that didn't look like every other couple's. No fields, no sunsets, no fairy lights. She found this location through an Urbex forum, where someone had posted photos of the hallways and rooms, and she literally saved every single one. Phelan pretty much went along with whatever she wanted for the photos. Friends said he wasn't really the type to push back on her ideas. Every couple wants their engagement photos to look unique, and I get that, but there's a line between creative and condemned, and I don't think she saw it. A friend of theirs who did portrait photography on the side agreed to shoot it. They entered through a gap in the fencing and a ground floor door that was already pried open. The building had been closed for over 15 years and condemned for nearly a decade. No electricity, no active maintenance, and no occupancy inspections had been conducted for years. The main wards were poured concrete, but the wing they entered was an older staff annex that used timber joist construction on the upper floors that had been exposed to weather through broken windows and roof damage for years. They took photos on the ground floor first, hallway shots, and a few in a room with peeling green paint that Marisol had specifically referenced from the forum photos. Then she wanted to go upstairs for the window light. The stairwell was concrete and still structurally sound, but the second floor hallway was different. The walls were water-stained, Sections of ceiling had already collapsed onto the floor, and the tiles were buckled and loose in places. They walked like 40 feet down the corridor and entered a room on the south side where these large windows let in the kind of soft, diffused light Marisol had been looking for. Phelan stepped in first. The floor held for a moment, maybe 2 seconds. Then the timber joists beneath the deteriorated subfloor gave way. The floor just opened up and he fell through to the level below, roughly 12 feet. He landed on broken concrete, broken metal framing, and debris from previous collapses that had piled up on the ground floor. Marisol was standing in the doorway when the floor went, close enough to the structural wall that her section held. She watched him fall.
I don't know how to talk about this one without thinking about the fact that she picked this building specifically because of how it looked, and the thing that made it look that way is the same thing that made the floor collapse.
The photographer and Marisol called 911 from outside the building. Emergency crews arrived within roughly 15 minutes, though getting to Phelan required entering the unstable structure, which took additional time while they assessed safe access routes. He was found on the ground floor unresponsive with massive injuries. He was transported to a nearby hospital where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Authorities later determined the cause of death to be multiple blunt force injuries sustained in the fall, with additional trauma from debris and exposed metal framing. The main access points were pretty much sealed up and additional fencing was installed within a couple months. Local officials reviewed whether the existing fencing and posted warnings met code requirements. This next one, I genuinely debated putting in because of how preventable it was. Like, the joke he made before it happened is something I still think about. It was the 23rd of July 2016, and a rented pontoon boat drifted across the flat surface of a bay on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, where the late morning sun reflected off the water, and a photographer crouched near the stern, adjusting a lens while a couple stood near the bow railing. Cullen Dietrich was 39 years old and worked as a brewery sales rep, covering accounts across the western Michigan area. Noreen Sabo was 37 and worked as an office manager at a chiropractic clinic. They had been together for 5 years and got engaged that winter. Their photographer later said Noreen had been talking about recreating the Titanic pose since like the very first planning call. She wanted the arms out, wind in the hair, sunset on the water look. She showed up to the boat rental with a white scarf she had bought specifically for the shot. Cullen literally joked to the photographer while they were boarding that at least their boat wouldn't sink.
If someone had told me this story and left out that joke, I'd still think it was awful, but knowing he actually said that right before it happened adds something that I can't put into words.
The boat was a standard rental pontoon, roughly 20 feet long, with a low railing around the perimeter. The rental operator had given a safety walkthrough that basically covered life jackets, the kill switch, and staying inside the railing. Cullen was operating the boat at idle speed. Neither he nor Noreen was wearing a life jacket. The photographer was seated near the middle of the deck. For the shot, Noreen climbed over the bow railing and stood on a narrow ledge on the outside of the boat, maybe 4 inches of footing between the railing and the edge. She faced forward with her arms out. Cullen stood behind the railing, holding her waist with the engine still in gear at low speed. The photographer framed the shot from behind them with the open water as the backdrop. They held the pose for several frames. The photographer later said the light was perfect, and the shots were looking exactly like what Noreen wanted. Then a larger recreational boat passed roughly 50 feet to their left, moving fast enough to throw a significant wake. The first wave hit the pontoon broadside, and the boat rocked sharply to the right. Noreen's balance shifted forward. Her feet slipped on the narrow ledge, and she grabbed for the railing but missed. Cullen tried to hold on, but his hands slipped on her shirt. She pitched forward off the ledge and entered the water near the bow. Cullen panicked and bumped the throttle forward before finding neutral, which surged the boat ahead and drove the propeller across the area where she had fallen. The photographer and Cullen heard her hit the water, but couldn't see her from where they were. Cullen ran to the stern and spotted her in the water several yards behind the drifting pontoon. He and the photographer pulled her out. She had these deep propeller lacerations across her pelvis, abdomen, and legs. It was genuinely horrific. 911 was called by the photographer. Marine patrol and local rescue crews reached them within roughly 15 minutes. Noreen was unresponsive and had lost a significant amount of blood. She was pronounced dead before they reached the marina. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death to be hemorrhagic shock from propeller lacerations. Investigators noted that neither occupant was wearing a life jacket and that the victim had been positioned outside the boat's safety railing at the time of the incident. The rental company updated its safety briefing to include specific language about staying inside the railing at all times during operation. Cullen gave a full statement, and the photographer provided a detailed account of the shoot and the moments leading up to the incident.
So this next one is the one where I keep thinking that they had every reason to know better because they had literally seen the location in other people's photos and still didn't think about what they were actually standing on.
It was the 8th of March, 2015, and the early spring air was cool and damp along a stretch of rural railroad right-of-way in central Georgia, where a single-track rail line crossed a narrow steel beam bridge over a river gorge roughly 60 feet below. Royce Clanton was 24 years old and worked as an assistant manager at a tire shop. Jessamine Kershaw was 23, and in her final year of nursing school, they had gotten engaged over Christmas, and the photo shoot was basically planned for the first warm weekend of the year. Jessamine's maid of honor later said Jessamine had found the bridge location on another couple's photography blog and saved a screenshot of the exact angle she wanted. She messaged a photographer asking if they would shoot on the bridge, and the photographer just said sure without even asking which bridge it was. When they arrived and saw the bridge was a narrow rail crossing with no walkway, no shoulder, and nothing but ties and open air between the rails, the photographer hesitated, but Royce and Jessamine were already walking onto the tracks.
I honestly wonder sometimes if that screenshot is what started all of this, because it seemed like once she had that image of this in her head of what the photo was supposed to look like, nothing was going to change her mind.
They walked roughly 40 feet onto the bridge. The photographer followed, but stayed near the bridge entrance where the embankment was still accessible on either side. The bridge had no walkway, no platform, no recessed safety area, just rails and ties with gaps wide enough to see the river 60 feet below. Royce and Jessamine held hands and posed, facing each other basically in the middle of the bridge, while the photographer shot from behind them with the gorge in the background. The photographer had taken roughly a dozen frames when they heard the train horn. It came from around a curve in the tree line, and the curve limited visibility enough that the train appeared much closer than expected once it emerged. The train was moving at roughly 40 miles per hour. Royce and Jessamine turned and started running back toward the end of the bridge, but the ties were uneven and awkward to run on. Every step had to land on a narrow beam with a gap on either side, and one wrong step meant a fall. The photographer heard the horn and scrambled back off the bridge onto the embankment, barely clearing the tracks. Royce and Jessamine were still on the bridge when the locomotive reached them. The photographer made it because she was close enough to the end to scramble off, and they were 40 feet out with nowhere to go and no time to get back. And that 30 feet of bridge is genuinely the difference between walking away and not walking away, and I keep losing sleep over it. The train engineer reported applying the emergency brake the moment he saw them on the bridge, but the stopping distance for a freight train at that speed far exceeded the remaining distance to the couple. Both Royce and Jessamine were struck by the front of the locomotive. The impact was catastrophic and immediate. Emergency crews were called by the train operator and by the photographer from the embankment. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. A forensic examination determined the cause of death for both to be multiple blunt force traumatic injuries consistent with a train impact at speed. The photographer was physically fine but was honestly transported for evaluation. The railroad company added fencing and expanded no trespassing signage at both bridge approaches later that year. The photographer gave a full statement. Investigators later figured out the bridge had basically been selected after Jessamine found similar engagement photos taken at the location online. This next one bothers me in a different way because they were both experienced hikers and they still looked at a viewing platform with a perfectly good angle and decided it wasn't good enough. It was the 3rd of June, 2018, and morning mist hung in the air at the base of a waterfall in a forested gorge in the Pacific Northwest, where a wooden viewing platform with a chest-high railing overlooked the falls from roughly 40 feet above the plunge pool, and a trail sign warned visitors not to leave the designated area. Thatcher Ainsley was 34 years old and worked as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic. Ramona Valise was 32 and taught middle school science. They hiked basically every weekend and had been together for 4 years before getting engaged that spring. Friends later said Thatcher and Ramona were the most outdoorsy couple she had ever worked with. They showed up in proper hiking boots and had their own trail snacks and trekking poles. When they reached the viewing platform above the falls, Ramona looked down at the base pool and said something about how the angle from up here wasn't going to work and they needed to get down there for the real shot. The photographer hesitated at the railing but didn't say anything when Thatcher said they had done worse descents than this. They were standing on a platform that was literally built so people could safely look at this waterfall and take photos of it, and they looked at it and said, "Nah, we need a better angle," and honestly, I still can't get past that. They left their packs at the platform and scrambled down a steep, muddy slope using tree roots and rocks as handholds. The descent was roughly 40 feet to the rock shelf at the base of the pool, and it took them like several minutes just to pick their way down. The rocks near the water were covered in algae and visible under the mist, and every surface near the pool was slick from the spray. The photographer stayed at the platform and shot downward with a long lens. They were posing on the rocks at the edge of the plunge pool when Ramona's foot slipped on an algae-covered surface. She went sideways. Her hip hit the rock first, and her momentum carried her into the pool. The water at the base of the falls looked calm from above, but beneath the surface was a recirculating hydraulic current that repeatedly pulled anything in the pool back under the falls. It caught her immediately and pulled her under. Witnesses reported seeing her surface briefly about 5 feet from where she fell in before the current pulled her back under. She did not surface again. Thatcher didn't even hesitate, he just jumped in after her. The same hydraulic caught him within seconds. The photographer on the platform watched both of them disappear beneath the churning water at the base of the falls. She called 911 immediately. A search and rescue team rappelled into the gorge within about 35 minutes. Both Thatcher and Ramona were recovered from the base of the plunge pool. Neither showed signs of life. Resuscitation was attempted on the rock shelf, but both had been submerged for too long. They were pronounced dead at the scene. Autopsy findings concluded the cause of death for both to be drowning, with the recirculating hydraulic current beneath the waterfall documented as the mechanism that repeatedly pulled them under. The viewing platform above the falls had literally been built to give people a safe spot to look from. Additional barriers and warning signage were installed at the descent point following the incident. The photographer's camera captured the moments leading up to the fall from the platform, and those images were included in the investigation file.
I almost didn't put this one in the video because it's the dumbest one, and I mean that literally because the thing that caused it is something that you learn in your first week of driving, and nobody even thought to check.
It was the 27th of September, 2014, and the last light of a late summer sunset lit the ridgeline above a gravel pullout along a scenic overlook road in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, where the drop from the overlook edge to the wooded slope below was roughly 80 feet with no guardrail or barrier. Whit Calloway was 31 years old and worked as a loan officer at a credit union. Darcy Embry was 29 and worked as a freelance graphic designer who did most of her work from home. They had been together for 2 years and gotten engaged that summer. Darcy had sent her photographer a mood board with like over 30 reference images before the shoot, and one of them was a sunset on the hood shot from a car commercial, the kind where the couple is sitting on the hood with the sky behind them. When they got to the overlook, Darcy immediately said this was the spot for the car shot. The overlook was gravel, with a gentle slope toward the edge and no barrier at the drop. Out of this entire video, this is the one that made me the most frustrated, because I don't know how 3 adults stand at the edge of a cliff with a car on a slope and not one of them thinks to check if the parking brake is on, and I've gone over it 100 times and I still can't explain it. Whit pulled the car forward so the front was facing the sunset and the overlook edge was behind the vehicle. Darcy climbed onto the hood. Whit stood beside the driver's door. The photographer backed up like 20 feet to get the wide frame with the sky and the ridge. Nobody thought to set the parking brake. Whit had shifted into park but never engaged the parking brake. Investigators believe the vehicle had not fully settled into the parking gear before he released the brake on the loose incline, and the wheels were angled slightly downhill. The car began creeping backward on the gravel, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. The photographer later said she noticed it moving, but thought it was just the car settling on the loose surface. Then it picked up speed. The loose gravel offered little traction, and the slope was steeper than it looked. Darcy tried to slide off the hood, but the car was rolling away from her feet first, and she couldn't get her legs under her. Whit saw it rolling and ran after it, grabbing for the driver's door handle. The rear wheels reached the edge of the overlook, and the back end dropped over. The car tilted sharply and went over with Darcy still on the hood. Whit lost his footing while trying to grab the open driver's side door as the vehicle went over the edge. Both fell with the vehicle down the wooded slope. The car rolled at least twice on the way down, shearing through small trees and brush. The photographer ran to the edge and called 911. Emergency crews reached the overlook within about 30 minutes and sent a rope team down the slope. The car was found far below the pullout, resting against a stand of trees. Both Whit and Darcy were found near the vehicle. Neither showed signs of life. They were transported to a regional hospital, where they were both pronounced dead. Authorities determined the cause of death for both to be multi-system blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from significant height, combined with vehicle rollover impact. The vehicle was examined and found to have zero mechanical failure. The parking brake just wasn't engaged, and the incline and loose gravel were basically what caused the rollback. The overlook was temporarily closed while the Park Service reviewed safety measures. Additional warning signage was posted. Investigators also interviewed the photographer, who confirmed the couple had been using the vehicle as a prop when it began rolling. I chose this last one as the closer, because every other couple in this video at least had some kind of plan that went wrong. These two just saw a wild animal and walked straight toward it like it was there for them. It was the 12th of October 2017, and the early morning frost was just starting to melt across a meadow in western Montana, where a bull moose stood near a tree line, roughly 100 yards from a trailhead parking lot, and a couple with a photographer walked along a path that curved toward the meadow's edge. Bridger Cowpey was 27 years old and worked as a fishing guide for a small outfitter based near Missoula. Sloan Everhart was 26 and worked as a receptionist at a vet clinic in town. They had been together for 3 years and gotten engaged that August. Bridger's coworkers later said he was genuinely the kind of guy who thought growing up in Montana meant he understood every animal in it. He had a habit of pointing out wildlife to clients on fishing trips and walking closer than the other guides would to get a better look. His boss had told him more than once to keep more distance. Sloan's best friend said she genuinely trusted Bridger completely when it came to anything outdoors. If he said something was safe, she believed him, and that was that. The part that stays with me is she didn't make her own call here. She trusted his, and his was wrong. They had been hiking to a meadow their photographer had scouted the week before for golden hour engagement shots. When they came around a bend in the trail and saw the bull moose maybe 100 yards away, Bridger told the photographer they should try to get it in the background. The photographer said she didn't think that was a good idea. Bridger said he had been around moose his whole life, and they were fine as long as you didn't get too close. He and Sloan just left the trail and walked toward the animal across the open meadow. The photographer stayed on the path. They got within roughly 40 feet. The moose had been feeding with its head down the entire time and showed no obvious signs of agitation, which is kind of probably why Bridger felt comfortable getting that close. Bridger positioned Sloan in front of him, with the moose visible in the background over her shoulder, exactly the framing he wanted. He turned to signal the photographer to start shooting. The moose briefly lifted its head and pinned its ears back, but Bridger either didn't notice or didn't think it mattered. Then it dropped its head and charged. There was no vocalization, no bluff charge, nothing. It just came, covering the 40 feet in what felt like 2 or 3 seconds. Bridger took the initial impact. The moose struck him with its antlers and chest, and the force threw him sideways to the ground. Sloan was standing directly behind him. She turned to run, but the moose redirected almost immediately, caught her within a few strides, struck her with its head, and trampled her as she went down. The photographer later said the sound was unlike anything she had ever heard. The attack lasted maybe 10 to 15 seconds total. The moose then just turned and walked away toward the tree line like nothing had happened. The photographer called 911 from the trail and didn't approach until the moose had moved into the trees. When she reached them, Bridger was conscious but unable to move, with severe injuries to his torso and abdomen from the antler strike. Sloan was unresponsive, roughly 15 feet from him, with severe blunt force injuries to her head and torso from the trampling. Emergency crews reached the meadow within about 25 minutes. Sloan was pronounced dead at the scene. Bridger was airlifted to a regional trauma center where he died the following day from severe blunt force trauma and internal injuries, along with puncture wounds from the antlers. Wildlife authorities responded and basically posted the area with temporary warning signage. Bridger's boss at the fishing outfitter gave a statement in which he described prior conversations with Bridger about keeping distance from wildlife. Witness statements were collected from everyone present, including the photographer who confirmed the couple had deliberately approached the moose for a photo.